Hello and welcome from all of us here at Common Sense to Social Media Rabbit Holes, how to pull kids back from spiraling out of control. I'm Lisa Solomon and I'm program lead of our Connected Schools program, which is a community of more than 100 mostly independent schools who, among many other things, help support these great online events. We're very grateful for the partnerships of the many Connected Schools communities joining us and thankful to all of you who support the nonprofit work that we do. When Common Sense was founded 20 years ago, the iPhone wasn't even around yet. And now so many of our kids are walking around with these mobile devices in their pockets, allowing potential 24/7 access to the internet. I'm looking forward to this conversation for many reasons, but the primary one is actually personal. I know we're supposed to model the behavior that we want to see in our own kids, but I certainly find myself doom scrolling late at night these days and can find it hard to step away. And I'm sure you might be able to relate. I'm a news junkie, and at times like this, when there's so much of the news out there that is so grim, social media can be an unsettling space, and even more so for our children, many of whom are not yet developmentally ready to take it all in. I need reminders to take breaks and turn off the tech so that I can take better care of my own mental health and support everyone else in my house. So we set up these conversations so that perhaps you will feel less alone in your own parenting journey as it relates to media and technology issues. And we know the challenges are very real. We intend always for you to come away with at least 2 or 3 tips you can try right away this week. And before we dive in, I just have a few very quick housekeeping items. This session will run for about 50 minutes. We'll do our very best to answer questions along the way, and I'll be monitoring the chat in real time. But please know that our team has read all of the questions submitted ahead of time, and we have threaded those into the preparation for this discussion. There were many questions sent in about screen time limits and specific platforms like YouTube and TikTok, as well as parental controls. So we don't have time to get so granular about these specifics during this hour, but remember that the Common Sense site has great free guidance on everything I just mentioned. And at the end of the webinar, I'll pull up this site so you can see where you can access all of those resources live. But for now, let's get started and learn from our panelists about ways to proactively talk with our kids about their social media use. I am delighted to introduce my colleague, Eisha Buch, as she'll be our moderator today. Eisha is the Director of Education Programs at Common Sense. She oversees so many things, including the award-winning K-12 curriculum. Eisha has more than 12 years of experience working in the education space, and her expertise is really in curriculum development, professional development, and program evaluation. She develops research-based curricula to support the digital well-being of all students, with dedicated efforts to help promote a positive learning culture around media and technology within our schools. Before joining Common Sense, Eisha was a middle school teacher and administrator in New York City. So welcome, Eisha. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to hand the program over to you now.
Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate it. And hi to everyone who's joining in live or those that will be listening later. I just feel like I have to make a disclaimer here before I get started. It is 5:04 here on the West Coast, which is where I'm at. And I am solo parenting right now for the next hour. And I have a 3 and a 5-year-old. They are downstairs. They have been set up with snacks. They've gone to the bathroom, and I am hoping that for the next hour I am not interrupted. But in case I am, I know you're in good hands without me. Just that's my disclaimer to you all. We all know the feeling that, being super embarrassed that you've just lost half an hour or more scrolling on your phone, or whether it's, comparing yourself to things that you see online or friends that you're noticing or influencers that you're noticing online, and social media kind of has my attention all the time. I'm really, really excited that you are here and joining this conversation today, because I think as adults, we really need to find ways to help support our own selves and our digital well-being. But it also is something that our young people are dealing with in much more pressing ways, given the developmental stages that they're at and the ways in which they're interacting and growing and building relationships. It's no secret that today's teens are struggling with mental health and that the striking decline in well-being also coincides with a very steep increase in social media use. We know that tech amplifies the normal challenges of adolescence, and it's clear that they're growing up in a rapidly changing digital landscape. Hello, AI, right? The conclusion here, however, is not that all tech is bad, which is a very good thing because it is clearly here to stay. And the issue is just very nuanced, something we will be digging into this evening. And our role as parents and educators and mentors is to guide young people to lean into those ways in which tech can be helpful and support their well-being. For example, the fact that my kids are watching a movie right now with tech, and give them the tools and the strategies to deal with the experiences that aren't helpful and that are potentially harmful to their well-being. At Common Sense, we've built a robust K through 12 curriculum working in partnership with Harvard Graduate School of Education for over a decade. And over the past year, we've come together with their new Center for Digital Thriving and have co-developed a first of their kind set of evidence-based lessons for schools to support young people's digital well-being. The work we have done is geared towards classrooms so teachers can use our lesson plans in the context of social emotional learning and to teach key digital citizenship topics. But the key insights are readily adapted for families. So today we'll be taking and talking all about those key insights from our work to help you foster meaningful connection and conversation with your child in an effort to support their and likely your own digital well-being. So now I would be so glad to introduce two of our researchers who we have worked with deeply to co-develop these resources and do this work, Emily Weinstein and Sophia Choukas-Bradley. Dr. Emily Weinstein is Executive Director of the brand new Center for Digital Thriving at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She is a psychologist who has spent over a decade researching the ways today's technologies are shaping and reshaping adolescents' lives. She is currently a principal investigator and research director at Project Zero at Harvard Graduate School of Education and the co-author with Carrie James of the popular book, Behind Their Screens, What Teens Are Facing and Adults Are Missing. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Eisha. Great to be with you.
And I would love to introduce you all to Dr. Sophia Choukas-Bradley. She is a clinical psychology lead at the Center for Digital Thriving and an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. She's the director of the Teen and Young Adult Lab, which conducts research on adolescent development and mental health with an emphasis on social media use. As a researcher, licensed clinical psychologist, and educator, she teaches undergrad and grad courses on adolescent development, provides clinical supervision, and regularly speaks and writes about adolescent social media use and mental health. Hi, Sophia.
Hi, Eisha. So happy to be here with you all.
Awesome. Well, to kick off this conversation, I just want to start with a few assumptions under which we're doing this work. First, it is all of our goals to improve adolescent well-being. Second, we know that tech is an extremely relevant part of our kids' lives. Third, we know that tech amplifies challenges that impacts teens' well-being. And what we know about supporting mental health broadly is very relevant and useful for thinking about strategies to support their digital well-being. So I want to kick it over to you, Emily, and have you share a little bit about your research and the methodology to best set us up for this conversation.
Okay, well, I'm so grateful to be here. So our research team has spent years really chasing answers to questions about what it looks and feels like to be a teenager growing up with technologies like smartphones and social media. And a hallmark of our research is really systematic, close listening to teens. So we ask questions like, what are adults missing that you most need us to understand? And as we listen, we really get a teen level view of the most relevant challenges from their perspectives. So we see more clearly things like the complexity of being a good friend in a digital age. What do you do when your friend is texting you and they need help, but it's getting late and you know you should go to sleep? So you have your own desire for self-care pitted against your desire to be a good friend. Two important values, really in tension with each other. We also hear about things like the digital pacifier concept, when teens or even adults use their phones for a kind of self-soothing to try and avoid feeling awkward or bored or uncomfortable. In our research, we center young people's different experiences and voices, and we're really willing to create space for the reality that technology is both. It's both connecting and isolating. It's both helpful and harmful. It's awesome. Sometimes it's awful. And these two things that I just talked about, the emphasis on youth voice and the idea, the recognition that tech is both, these are like ingredients that for us have just changed the whole recipe of the research process. And as I know we're going to talk about today, they've really transformed the kinds of ideas and interventions about how we can help, how we can connect evidence-based practices to teens' true pain points. And I'm so glad that we have Sophia with us for this conversation, because she's been such a key part of that process and of that thought leadership as we think about what it looks like to take what we understand about teens' perspectives and their digital lives and really connect them to the kinds of practices that can help.
That's amazing, super helpful. I just want to echo that. Sophie, your work has been foundational to these resources we've co-developed. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about your work and this evidence base that the resources draw upon.
Absolutely. First of all, it's just so inspiring to hear Emily talk about the work you've done and to be with you as well, Eisha, and to think about all that Common Sense has done in this space. So my role on this team is as the clinical psychology lead for the new Harvard Center for Digital Thriving. I was brought onto the team based on my work more broadly as a clinical psychologist. So I was trained to provide mental health services for adolescents. Currently, my major role is as a researcher and educator at the University of Pittsburgh. And there I had the privilege a few years ago of starting a collaboration with Dr. Brian Galla at the Pitt School of Education. And we were really interested in trying to understand how can we help adolescents use social media in a values-aligned way. Social media is not all bad or all good, and it is definitely not going anywhere, as we've already heard about tonight. And so our goal was to figure out, first of all, what are the subjective, nuanced experiences that kids can have with social media that either promote or hinder positive mental health and development? And then how can we develop resources, interventions that help adolescents to make choices about how to use their time on social media that aligns with their values and promotes time well spent, to use a term first coined by Tristan Harris, who used to be an engineer for Google. So Dr. Galla and I developed an initial set of resources, a very brief intervention actually, that aimed to educate adolescents about some of the manipulative design tricks that tech companies can use to hook all of us and that are especially relevant for teens. Teens are especially susceptible to them. So for example, bottomless news feeds, endless scrolling, and quick rewards that give us all dopamine hits in our brains. And we provided both education about some of those manipulative practices and then tools for helping to motivate adolescents to take control over their social media use. And in my work most recently with the Center for Digital Thriving, including working closely with Emily Weinstein and her colleagues and working with Eisha and others at Common Sense, our goal has been to take principles from clinical psychology, evidence-based principles related to how to change one's thoughts in order to change one's feelings and behaviors, and bring that into the work that Dr. Galla and I had done, where we rigorously tested some early iterations of these resources. So we've really joined forces and taken advantage of the long-term work that Common Sense has been doing to improve digital citizenship, the work that Emily Weinstein and Carrie James have done to promote digital thriving, bringing it all together with this rich evidence base to create the resources that we're going to talk to you about tonight.
I love that. And it's from the curriculum development standpoint, we're just so grateful for the research that you all are doing to help inform the curriculum in a really meaningful way. We often hear from teens that social media can spark this all too common feeling of like, all my friends have better lives than me. And a seemingly innocuous design feature like read receipts can lead teens knowing that their message has been seen and then stressing out about why a friend hasn't replied. They must be mad at me. I said the wrong thing. I'm such an idiot. And these negative thoughts can actually get more serious as we think about all of the concerning and problematic content young people can be experiencing day in and day out. Yeah. And I know, Sophia, that like a lot of your work is rooted in your expertise is in cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm curious how CBT can help combat this type of negative self-talk.
Yeah, so far I've given a broad overview of some of the work I've done that's helped to contribute to these resources. What I haven't talked about is what is cognitive behavioral therapy and how does that come into play to the resources that we've developed. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a major type of therapy with a very strong evidence base from clinical psychology, which has to do with how we can change our thoughts in order to change the way we feel and in order to change our behaviors. And Eisha, some of the thoughts that you were giving examples of are classic examples of what we call in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive distortions, otherwise known as thinking traps. So at a very basic level, these are automatic thought patterns, which if left unchecked, can lead to feelings of anxiety and depression and other mental health struggles. CBT is all about learning how to identify our habitual patterns of getting stuck in specific problematic thoughts and recognizing those thought patterns and then changing the way we think in order to change how we feel and in order to change how we behave.
Amazing. And I have to say, I, as an adult, fall into this type of thinking a lot.
We all
But
do.
Emily, we know that adolescents are more susceptible to falling into these thinking traps, but is there anything particularly specific or meaningful around media and tech that exacerbates that kind of thinking?
Yeah, I think many of us probably have an intuition that the answer is yes. I mean, and it's true. So many of the features of social media and even texting are ripe for pulling us into thinking traps. We have a lack of social cues. We have people selectively sharing their sort of highlights and best moments. We have new kinds of metrics to try and interpret, like, what does it mean if you liked my picture, but you didn't comment? Or if I see that you commented, but your comment on my picture isn't as nice as the comment I just saw you leave on our other friend's photo. And you mentioned like read receipts. What happens if I see that you read my message, but you didn't reply? Does that mean that you're mad at me? So for sure, the features of social media, the features of that come along with this kind of communication can amplify that. The good news is that we have a lot of research, as Sophie was mentioning, on how to actually help with thinking traps. And even just being able to notice when we're experiencing them and have the name that goes along with it, that can really help. And that's one reason why we got so excited about coming together. And I think you listeners probably got this sense, but these new resources that are rooted in helping connect thinking traps, cognitive distortions to social media, these are the result of new kinds of interdisciplinary collaboration and partnership, but also co-design with teens. So we have really involved teens in the process of thinking about what kinds of thinking traps are most relevant, even in decisions like the decision to use the phrase thinking traps instead of the phrase cognitive distortions, and a lot of the other sort of linguistic choices and examples that we draw on.
Amazing. Okay, so on that note, let's get into what some of these thinking traps are, which is one of my favorite things to learn about. Emily and Sophie are going to go through a set of 7 common traps, which are a really great place to start. But as I started learning about this and working with Sophie and Emily, like there are a lot more thinking traps. This is a really great place, and I think is all encompassing of a lot of the common negative self-talk experiences that we all have.
Okay, so the first one is all or nothing thinking. When you make big generalizations like, all my friends have better lives than me. And common words that were in an all or nothing thinking trap are words like all, always, never, none, everyone, nobody. This one for many of us is linked to social comparison. And that's really important because the kinds of comparisons like everyone on my feed is so much happier than me, or even she's always so happy. Why is this person always so happy? Those are the kinds of thoughts and thinking traps that we know can be really important when we try and understand the relationship between social media use and mental health and well-being.
The next one is labeling. So this is when you use negative labels for yourself. We all do this from time to time, and most of us do this online. So teens or adults might notice that their post didn't get as many likes as someone else's and have a thought like, I'm a failure. Parents describe this a lot in my experience. So comparing your parenting and how it appears online to the parenting of somebody else and adding a label to yourself like I'm a bad parent or I don't have my stuff together the way these other parents do. So it's labeling something core about yourself based on what you see online or in other contexts.
All right, the next one is mind reading. So this is when you assume you know what someone else is thinking or feeling, and often that it's about you and it's bad. So the example we gave earlier, my friend didn't respond to my text, so she must be mad at me. I think a lot of adults can relate to this one. If maybe you've sent an email to a colleague at work or sent a text to a friend, and then they don't reply right away, and you're wondering, like, did I say the wrong thing? They must think they must be mad at me. They must think I am a jerk for saying that or for not saying this thing. So this is one that definitely comes up when we ask adults. This is a common one we hear they resonate with.
Emily and I joke about how that applies to us because I'm often very slow at responding to texts. It is not because I'm mad at Emily.
But Sophie, having the language, I feel like has been so helpful because we can say to each other now, like, I'm mind reading. Are you mad at me?
This is very relevant for adults too. The reason it's extra relevant for kids is because during this time in life, during adolescence, youth are so attuned to what their peers are thinking about them. It's just a totally developmentally normal part of being an adolescent. And so as much as we as adults experience these things, just keep in mind that it's extra relevant for teens. So the next one is negative filter. Again, relevant for teens and adults. So this is when you focus only on the negatives. It's as if you have a filter that's causing you only to see the negative and not the positive of a situation. This happens a lot online. Most of the feedback that teens get, same with parents and other adults, is positive or neutral. But most of us will really obsessively focus on just one negative thing. So teens will get mostly positive feedback on a photo, but they might get one negative comment, or perhaps a friend didn't respond or didn't comment on the photo, and it feels negative. The absence of feedback can feel negative. Dwelling on that is where the problem lies.
Okay, so the next one is shoulds. When you think about what you should or shouldn't be like, I think for myself, this is one that gets really wrapped up in sort of my mom guilt experience, feeling like what I should or shouldn't be doing or feeling in different moments. And this one, actually, I will say, was also especially common when we were doing trainings with teachers at the end of the summer. We would hear teachers say things like, I have like such a case of the shoulds around my summer break, like feeling like I should have done more prep or I should have used my time differently over the summer.
Sometimes I playfully refer to that as shoulding all over yourself. So maybe people can relate. Personalizing is when you put the blame on yourself or assume something is about you in the absence of evidence that it's about you. So for example, teens might experience things where a friend posts to say they're feeling sad or depressed, and the teen thinks it's their fault, or even if they didn't cause the sadness, that it's their job to fix it or address it. So personalizing has long been common for adolescents, but it's really amplified in a social media context when adolescents and adults are just bombarded with social feedback from people around them.
Okay, and the last one we have in this set is fortune telling. So this is when you assume you know what's going to happen next and you make an assumption that it's going to be bad. So maybe for a teen, I was up all last night playing video games. I know I'm going to fail my test now. And maybe for us, it comes up in something like, I know that Thanksgiving is going to be a disaster, or some other kind of fortune telling predicting the future that actually adds to our stress and our sense of anxiety about what's coming next.
And one quick note is that these aren't mutually exclusive. One situation could involve many different thinking traps at once. That's really common.
That makes me feel better. So I've done so many of them just today. I will say, I just wanted to point out for any parent who was like, oh my gosh, this is gold, and like, what do I do with this? We actually, all three of us in our organizations, co-developed with Above the Noise, with KQED, a video that kind of walks through these in a really approachable way for teens. So we will drop those links in, or we'll send them after. But it's a really great way to kind of learn about these with your teen. Like Emily and Sophia have said, these are things that we as adults experience all the time. I'm curious, Emily, is there anything, like, now that I kind of know about these traps, like, what do I do?
Well, I think Sophie will hopefully talk after me about cognitive restructuring. And I know we've been so excited working on some of the resources to make really accessible some strategies you can use to help yourself get out of a thinking spiral. But I will say, even just starting with the process of recognizing these and introducing the language and normalizing that it is totally normal to fall into thinking traps. As Sophie said, this happens to all of us. These are common to everyone, adults included. And noticing them in ourselves and then modeling that for our kids can be really powerful. In general, when it comes to tech parenting, modeling is such a major move. It's something we can do around our habits when we say things like, oh, I'm like feeling really distracted by my phone tonight. Let me turn off my notifications, or let me go put my phone down across the room so I can really focus on what you're saying or on playing together. Modeling the ways that we think about reintroducing boundaries and protecting the things that we most care about is so powerful. So modeling can start with those kinds of tech habits, but it can also include things like just vocalizing, oh, I'm in a thinking trap. Oh, this is a thinking trap. That can be a really helpful move. And it's one that I know because I have been this fall in a bunch of different schools and communities talking to teens about thinking traps. It's amazing to watch them react to the language and feel so seen and feel like, oh my gosh, that happens to me. And we're like, yes, that happens. And you're not doing anything wrong. And let's talk about what we can do about it. So that's a big one. And I know that some of our teams have really also loved the suggestion of if it feels too awkward to you to think about like naming your own thinking traps, one thing that you can do with your kids and with your family is like watching a TV show or a movie and identify when characters are engaging in thinking traps. Recognizing these patterns in other people can make them easier to spot for ourselves.
I love that suggestion. I'm just curious if you have any recos on some TV shows that we could watch.
Well, I think it depends what your kids are watching. So start there. You might be able to find thinking traps in just about any show. But I know we were talking about Eisha that in Seinfeld, George Costanza is like regularly mind reading and fortune telling. In Harry Potter, you often can find Harry Potter personalizing. That's a thinking trap he falls into. What about for you, Eisha? What shows come to mind?
I love the show Never Have I Ever. And I feel like Baby, if anyone's ever watched it, she's a high schooler. I think it was like maybe me when I was a high schooler, or like a better version of myself when I was in high school. I mean, I think she's like kind of textbook every one of these, but she shoulds all the time and has a negative.
Shoulds all over herself.
Shoulds all over herself. And very relatable. But again, to the point of like this is super helpful. And I personally have just found that being able to spot them in my own thinking has allowed me to kind of get out of that spiral. But what can we do? Like, I would say, what is the thing that we can do once we're experiencing it? Like, is there a next step, Sophie?
Yeah, so this is where we get into the heart of CBT. First, a disclaimer, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but our resources in this webinar tonight can't be a substitute for true cognitive behavioral therapy practice by a clinical psychologist or another licensed mental health professional. And we can all learn some of these basic strategies that are a core part of CBT and use them to experience better digital well-being, digital thriving. So let me give a quick note about what cognitive restructuring is. This is a fancy label that simply means trying to change the way we think, literally trying to restructure how we think, as the name suggests. So there are 3 helpful strategies that we suggest. The first strategy is to try to distance yourself from the negative thought and try to come up with alternative explanations for the thought. So for example, imagine an adolescent has a friend who has left them on read. As we heard earlier, that means they can see that the friend has read a text message or another message, but has not responded. That can be really triggering and upsetting for a teen. So the first step would be asking, what are other explanations for why the friend might have left you on read and not yet responded, or rather on read. I am saying that wrong because I am old. So this is where Emily and I joke that we actually do this with each other. There are a million reasons I might not have responded to her text. The same is certainly true for teens and their friends. A friend could be busy. They could be in a sports game at this moment in time. They could be with their family. They could have left their phone somewhere and forgotten about it. Their phone could have died. They could have read the message and just decided they don't know what to say yet, but that doesn't mean my friend is mad at me. So that's the first strategy, is to distance yourself from the thought and try to come up with alternative explanations. The second strategy is to ask yourself, is there any evidence that can disprove my thought? So it's similar, but not exactly the same as the idea of trying to come up with other explanations. So this would be where we'd ask kids, first of all, is there any evidence for the thought? Has your friend been mad at you recently such that it might be a realistic assumption that they're mad at you now? What about evidence that they're not mad at you? For example, have they ever gone without responding to your text? Have they left you unread before? If so, could that give you evidence that there's some other possible explanation other than they are mad at me? So we can distance ourselves from the thought. We can try to come up with alternative explanations, and we can ask, is there evidence against my thought, disproving my thought? Another helpful strategy that's really helpful with teens is to think about how would you advise a friend in this situation. So sometimes adolescents get stuck. If we ask, okay, can you come up with any other evidence to suggest that your friend isn't mad at you? Can you come up with an alternative explanation? They might get stuck. But we could say, what would you say to a friend who tells you someone else hasn't responded to their message? And sometimes an even more helpful strategy to kind of shake things up is to say, what would you say to a younger person who's just gotten their first phone? What would you say to someone who doesn't really know how text messaging works or how social media works? Is there any possible explanation for this situation other than my friend is mad at me? Eisha, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah. Before I wanted to just say, in listening to Sophie before we jump to the next question, that it's so interesting because even though obviously we've all as a team spent a lot of time thinking about this, it's when I hear Sophie give those explanations, I think about how different, how much of a pivot it is from most of our instinctive reactions. So if you imagine a teen saying to you, like, I'm so upset, like, I'm panicking, my friend left me on red, or someone left me on red, you might have an instinctive reaction to just roll your eyes or say, like, that's no big deal. And instead, Sophie just teed up a whole slew of evidence-based strategies that are things we can say instead that really validate their experience, but also help them move out of the feeling of being stuck in the anxious thought and productively do like the cognitive distancing and the restructuring. I just think those are such powerful moves. And they're also so powerful in part because they are the opposite of, I think, what most of us might do and then later feel like, oh, like that didn't open up the conversation I was hoping. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, these are really, really powerful strategies. And I think at the core, what I love about it is that it is also practicing the idea of exploring other perspectives, like, right, being able to look at it in a more objective way and kind of see it from all corners, that thought that you have. And I think that's just a really powerful thing that we want to practice in ourselves, and we want our kids to practice too. So, I mean, these seem like really helpful strategies. I'm curious, Sophie, do you think I can rid myself of all this negative self-talk by next week?
I wish it was as simple. And I, however, would probably be out of a job as a therapist if it was as simple as we tell you in one webinar, do these few things, and then all of the way you think will change. So it does take a lot of practice. And as I mentioned, this isn't meant to be a replacement for therapy for kiddos who need it. So certainly common sense and many clinical psychologists recommend that if an adolescent is struggling with mental health concerns, first of all, in addition to seeking psychotherapy for them, one thing I do recommend, and I believe common sense supports this as well based on their research, is monitoring kids' social media accounts with their knowledge. I do not endorse secret monitoring, but letting adolescents know that some monitoring may happen can be a really important safety behavior for parents if you're truly worried about your kids' mental health. And mental health concerns are on the rise in the US among teens. So with the major caveat that this webinar won't be enough to radically change the way we all think, and that some folks will need extra mental health services and parental monitoring may be important. I do want to note that practicing these conversations, practicing between parents and adolescents, encouraging adolescents to practice with their friends, with each other, is really, really powerful. As Emily said earlier, just the knowledge, just learning to identify problematic thinking practices or patterns rather, is one really important step in the right direction. And then practicing by watching the TV shows and looking for examples of cognitive distortions, by watching within ourselves for examples. These are really powerful things. I want to highlight something Emily just said. She noted the importance of validating adolescents' feelings. One really important step in productive conversations with teens about tech or about anything as parents is to validate kids' feelings without necessarily validating their thoughts. Let me give you an example. If a kid is having the thought, I've been left on red. That means my friend's mad at me. They haven't responded. They're mad at me. You can validate that your kid is feeling anxious. And it's extra great if you can model that you sometimes feel anxious when you're waiting for someone to respond. That's totally normal. You can validate the feeling without saying, yes, your friend is definitely mad at you. So you can validate the feeling and then help the kid identify other ways of thinking about the situation, which, as Eisha said, might shake up new ways of thinking about different perspectives. And wrapping this up, I think it's really important, and Emily mentioned this too, for parents to model your own vulnerability. So for example, in her research with Carrie James, kids talked about the value of parents sharing their own struggles with tech. And I believe she'll be talking about that more in a few minutes.
Sophia, I loved what you were just saying about the importance of the differentiation between validating the feeling and the behavior, which I know is something that you often talk about and remind us about. And it's such a helpful distinction. I also really appreciate that so much of this is around tapping into our own sense of empathy and the way that empathy actually changes the whole character of the conversations we have. And I will say, like, doing research and really sitting alongside teens and hearing their perspectives and hearing what it's like for them around social media, I think it just naturally tees up so much empathy for what is hard. And what's so interesting is that, at least for me, it's felt like so much is, and I don't know if you felt this way too, but like so much is familiar. Like the feelings are familiar. The feeling of how hard it is when you find out that all your friends were hanging out without you. That feeling is very familiar, even though the practice of maybe seeing your friends on Find My Friends or on SnapMap, that's something that maybe adults today don't have experience with as a teen. We can actually pull back the layers of the behavior and look at the feeling that's familiar. And I think that can really help us tap into empathy, but also then identify the wisdom that we have to share. So even if you have never looked at SnapMap or seen on Venmo your friends charging each other and found out that way that you were left out of a movie plan, you probably have been left out at some point, and you probably do have really powerful advice for your kids. I'll just say one more thing here. One of the things that we think about that was so interesting for us to really grapple with was this idea that most of us have this feeling of like, we walk into the cafeteria and we're trying to figure out like who's sitting together and where should I sit. And in many ways, it's like social media has made it so that experience of like monitoring the cafeteria and figuring out your place is like happening all the time. And you're constantly having to figure out like, where do I fit into this, and who's sitting with whom, and how does that make me feel, and what do I do about it? So it's not just that, it is an amplification. So I want to say that the feelings are very familiar, and also the scale at which kids are experiencing them, the amplifications are in many ways really exponential.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And what comes to my mind is that this is hard, and navigating life with tech is hard, and teens acknowledge that. Like, I think the thing that I want young people to understand, though, is that it's not just all on them. And it's like there is something drawing us to our devices in ways that was not happening when we were growing up. And it's really important that they kind of understand how it works, so that they're kind of taking a little bit of the onus off of themselves. I think that maybe helps give them agency. And I'm just wondering, if we think about digital well-being more broadly, and one of those more important steps is understanding how devices and apps are built to keep us tethered. Emily, is there anything you can kind of share or break down for us as it relates to that concept?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, the tech that we use every day is really strategically and intentionally designed to capture and hold our attention. And over time, tech companies have gotten better and better at knowing what will pull us in, what will keep our eyes on the screen. So design tricks are features that tech companies use that help capture and sustain attention, in many cases by playing on our instincts and our psychological tendencies. And one of the things that's so interesting is that these kinds of design tricks, they pull us all in, but in many ways they're playing and preying on developmental sensitivities, and the pulls are even stronger for kids, for adolescents whose self-regulation is quite literally still developing. And just to make that concrete, Sophie actually mentioned a few features earlier, but if you think about the idea of infinite scroll, that idea that you're scrolling, your newsfeed never ends, You might actually be able to remember a time when you had Facebook and you would scroll to the end of your feed and like that was it. The feed just ended. There was no more content. But actually, designers figured out that if the feed just kept going, we would keep going too. So that's an example of a design feature that is really a design trick for holding our attention. Things like the heart or thumbs icon that appears when you post, like the like button, the text bubble that pops up when someone's typing so that you're curious, you're wondering like, what are they going to say? There are so many more of these. And these kinds of features can really undercut teens' agency because they're really playing and preying on our attention. And so one of the things that we want to think about as we think about supporting digital well-being is how we can help teens really reclaim their agency.
Yeah, those tricks are get me all the time. I mean, I'm curious, like what, like, can you share a little bit more about why? Like, what is the motive for a company to use these types of tricks?
Well, we're in an attention economy. So a key motive is profit. The longer we stay on an app and continue scrolling or watching or posting or clicking, the more data we're creating, the more data the company can collect about us. And they can ultimately use that data, sell it to third-party companies for profit, or use it to inform recommendations about what other kinds of content will keep us scrolling. So that's part of it. But these tricks, one of the things that's really important is that these tricks aren't just about cultivating compulsive habits. They can also really heavily influence how we feel about ourselves, how we think about the world around us. So algorithms are another aspect of tech design that, for example, can pull us further into doom scrolling or toward increasingly extremist content. We don't want kids to be alone trying to make sense of this all or feeling like they did something wrong when they stumble across something that's confusing or upsetting, that in many cases is being kind of served up or pushed up to them because of design features. So these are in many cases issues that are created or reinforced by design, but they're also issues that we can push against more deliberately, helping youth, again, as I said, like really thinking about reclaiming digital agency and cultivating, as Sophie mentioned, values-aligned habits, which Sophie and Brian Galla's work has been so instrumental in helping us appreciate the importance of that kind of values language when we think about our tech habits. One more pivot I'll just mention is that my colleague Carrie James and I have spent a lot of time thinking about how adults often get stuck in this role of being like a referee around screen time, where we're just like blowing the whistle when kids do something wrong or when they're over screen time. But there are so many tricky things about tech and about growing up with tech, and kids really need us to embrace more of a coaching role where we're not just in this ref mindset, but we're actually thinking about what would it look like to coach them in developing the kinds of skills and dispositions that they need to be able to navigate the hard plays.
I love that. Anything, Sophie, that you might add based on kind of your experience and research as well on this topic?
It's all beautifully said. One piece I want to amplify is just thinking about why are we emphasizing these things for adolescents specifically? And Emily, you probably have stuff you want to add on this too. But one thing we haven't mentioned is at a very broad level, adolescence is this period in life. We've mentioned the importance of peers, but it's also a period of time when brains are still developing. And it's really hard to strike the right balance in conversations with kids, but really important to try to normalize how hard it is for all of us, and especially adolescents, to fight back against spending time on social media in ways we don't want to spend it, based on how well designed these tech platforms are and these tools are. They're by design trying to capture our attention. But this is the period of life when adolescents' brains are what we call developmentally plastic. Adolescents can make changes that have a big impact on their development. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later.
Oh, I love that. It just like brings a lot of hope to this. I think a lot of parents, find themselves feeling really overwhelmed and like, what can I do? And just knowing that change can happen is really helpful and hopeful and positive. And on that, I think it's like a great segue to us thinking about how we can put all of this into action. And so, on that note, thinking about our tech habits and how they impact our well-being is something that I think we all need to be reflective about. Some habits can help support our well-being, and others can certainly make things harder. So how can we talk about the habits, both the good and the bad, with our kids while supporting their sense of agency?
This is such an important question. And I think especially so because it's something that one of the things that's been so interesting, I think, as we have been piloting resources to try and help support better tech habits for kids, is that we found that as we are teaching adults about how to use the resources consistently, every adult has this sense of like, oh, I need to be doing this. This is something that's so relevant for me. We can just start by actually just acknowledging that, and that common ground, knowing that we're actually all navigating the pull of these screens and tech habits that serve us and tech habits that don't. That can be a really powerful foundation. So I know Sophia and Eisha are also in this category, but I've had hundreds of conversations, maybe thousands at this point, with teens about technology and about their tech habits. And one of the key moves that I know our research team has really found makes a difference in our conversations is actually opening questions by asking about the positive rather than just jumping to the negative. So we ask questions like, what are the best parts of the ways you use tech right now? Or what are some of the good tech habits you have? And these kinds of questions are so interesting because actually when we do have good tech habits and we label them and we identify them, they help us feel more committed to the things we are already trying to do that are helpful. But they also open up and tee up different kinds of conversations, because by understanding and signaling to teens that we get that there are things that they're trying to do well, we get that there are upsides for them of using these technologies. When we start conversations there, we can then talk together and move into thinking about what kinds of pain points they have, whether there are tech habits they wish they could change, whether there are tech habits they have that make them feel bad, or that are getting in the way of their goals for themselves. We can ask those questions, and the tone and tenor of the conversation just is different because we have created space to do that kind of acknowledgement of the both and.
I love that. And through the new resources that we've co-developed, we want adolescents definitely to reflect on the ways media and tech are impacting their well-being, but also to recognize that their tech habits can change, to Sophie's point. In one of the lessons, we do have students develop a personal challenge that allows them to experiment with this. And so, Emily, can you talk us a little bit through what that looks like?
Sure. And I just saw a question came through in the chat about how we can do coaching. And I actually think this is a great example. So one assumption that some adults have is that teens don't think about or care about their tech habits. And so it's really transformative to listen to teens talk about what's working for them and what's harming their well-being. And if you can imagine that you get into that coaching role, you're putting teens, sorry to mix metaphors here, but you're putting teens kind of into the driver's seat of asking them questions like, how are your tech habits going right now? One thing I will say is that if there is any sense that you are asking the question only to impose a new role or restriction, it will shut down the kind of authentic reflection that we often get a front row seat to. But I know, because we have now as teens, so many teens in so many different classrooms, this question. And one of the things that we see that's so fascinating is that there is a lot of very real variation in the pain points that kids feel like they want to address. So for some, it's gaming. Maybe they feel like gaming has really important upsides and social benefits and entertainment benefits, but it's really hard to pull away from. And they want to think about how to sort of regulate their game time or how to manage their gaming time. Maybe for others, there are challenges that are linked to YouTube or to who they're following on Instagram. For some, we hear that there are positive habits that they want to cultivate, like getting more balanced news or using social media in ways that build an interest or that inspire them, or using their Apple Watch as they're doing a certain kind of sports training. So creating space for them to think about what tech habits they want to have, that can actually be a really helpful and sort of straightforward first coaching move.
That's great. And I think like one of the key things I think here that to me is a theme and a trend that I want to take in my parenting is that, one, we want to model for our kids the things that we want, that we think are healthy and promising habits. And two, we want to be vulnerable, because when we are vulnerable with them about the ways in which these things are impacting ourselves, we can find that common ground and connect with them more deeply. And I think it's the goal to me is not to get to the point of, like the first conversation I have with my child and they now have like way better well-being and I just solved everything. It's that, oh wow, like we had a conversation. We connected on this. they shared with me something about their digital life that I did not know. And that is so powerful. But to the vein of being able to model, I think this tech habit challenge idea is such a great thing to do alongside your child, because we all, again, are able to and are in pursuit of more balance and well-being in our life. So it is something that I think, even if you have different habits that you're trying to change, maybe you participated in doing it together and you keep each other accountable. And just know that when you're coming up with these types of habit changes, it's really helpful to make sure that you've picked a habit that you actually want to change. So really do that reflection of like, what is it that is that pain point that I really feel like changing? Be as specific as possible with what you'll do differently. Not, I'm just going to limit my screen time. That's too vague. You really need to think specifically about what you might do instead, because that's going to help you come up with a way to actually reduce the screen time, right? And then start small. So, choose something that feels very doable, and know that you're more likely to succeed if you do something that's small and doable, and you can easily build on that in the future. And so those are really great strategies and techniques to use for yourself, and to also kind of model and try with your child. And just always give yourself grace, give your child grace. It is okay if a habit doesn't stick. I think of every single New Year's resolution that I've created for myself. And it takes time. And so give it a few days. If it isn't something that sticks, you can always revisit it and find something that does work. Anything that you all would add to kind of this idea about kind of creating a habit change?
I have something to add, not about creating a habit change, but about the nature of conversations between kids and parents more broadly, amplifying some of what Emily was getting at. So as in my training as a clinical psychologist, I learned that above and beyond any specific techniques, for example, the cognitive restructuring techniques we've been focusing on tonight, what matters the very most, according to research, not research conducted by myself, but more broadly in clinical psychology, between a therapist and a client, is the nature of the relationship and how much the client feels heard. We also know from research on couples therapy that the most important thing in determining relationship quality, as long as basic values are aligned, is the quality of communication between partners and how well they feel like the other person is able to really hear them. And we know that this is true for parents and kids as well. Read Emily's book and really think about how you can actively listen to what your adolescent is telling you about their tech use and validate what you're hearing from them. Repeat back what you're hearing, validate the feelings so that they feel heard and are more likely to share more. You might be surprised about what you hear. And that's an important backbone of everything else we're talking about related to cognitive restructuring, habit change, or anything else from the resources that we've co-developed.
I love that. Anything else, Emily, before I turn us to one last hopeful thought that each of us have?
Oh, that was great. Thank you, Sophie.
Amazing.
I feel whenever I listen to Sophie, I'm like, yes, I'm so inspired by that. I'm going to do that better tomorrow.
Unless it's via text, and then you're not validated or inspired at all. Yeah.
With better communication.
I love it.
I hear you.
So, on this last note, I'm just like, I feel really hopeful just in having this conversation with both of you. And I'm just curious if you had one thing you wanted to share about what is making you particularly hopeful at this point in time. What is that? And I will turn it over to you, Emily.
Okay. Well, I feel hopeful because I think one thing is that listening to youth and really understanding what's hard, we are getting so much more information about what will be helpful. And I think that we are all doing a better job collectively in our field of starting to really look forward to imagine a future where young people really can thrive, where they do have digital well-being, where we are thinking about how to protect and uplift the things that matter most, many of which are the things that Sophie was just mentioning. So that is really helpful. And just recognizing, I think, as parents, like, you have so much wisdom to add to this. Do not feel like just because you don't know what like a reel is or threads are that you have nothing to add to the conversation. I mean, Sophie and I like sometimes get the terminology wrong, and we are people who have studied this for decades. The tech is changing so fast, but it does not mean that you do not have crucial wisdom that your kids need, you absolutely do. So don't get so lost in the terminology that you can't unpack and see the feelings behind it and the ways that you can help. One last thing I'll say is just that I know a lot of the burdens that we talked about are created and reinforced by design. And I feel really hopeful about the fact that we are seeing more young people pushing back against tech and calling for policy changes. We're seeing more advocacy for policy change. And I'm hopeful and excited about the idea of a future where many of these responsibilities are less on the shoulders of individual kids and parents and teachers, and where we have a broader context that is more conducive to the kinds of agency that we're hoping to support.
Amazing. Thank you, Emily. And Sophie, what is one thing you're hopeful for?
I loved what Emily said. I feel hopeful about the number of parents who came here tonight. I think it's really important for parents to be invested, as you all are, by nature of having come here and taken this hour out of your busy lives. I think it's so important for parents to learn more about tech. One way to do that is from a webinar like this, and another way is from talking directly with your kids. And I want to amplify again something Emily said, which is that it's really important to listen to kids' own experiences. And we want to make sure you walk away tonight feeling empowered to be parents when it comes to tech. So for example, I know there was a question that came in earlier about sleep. And my opinion, based on the research literature as a clinical psychologist, is that kids should not have phones with them at night unless there's a very specific medical need, such as for kids whose diabetes requires tracking with an app on their phone, in very rare circumstances. But the reason I bring this up is I think there is a balance, and I think there's hope here for parents to have agency to parent around tech use, and to actively listen with curiosity and open hearts to understand what this tech world is like for their kids, with all the good and the bad and the messiness that involves.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. I have learned a lot. Even though we work on this work regularly, I just get more insights every time we talk. I want to thank all of you who have been listening in. And I think I'm going to go get ice cream with my kids because we made it. But I want to turn it over to you, Lisa, to wrap us up.
Thank you, Eisha, and a big thank you to Emily and to Sophie as well. I've learned so much through this conversation, and there's so much more many more questions I have. We'll do this again. But before we sign off, I also wanted to acknowledge that so many of you submitted questions wanting details about specific social media platforms and other topics like limit setting and parental controls. And I just wanted to remind you quickly how to get all those resources on the Common Sense Media site, which does go way beyond just our ratings and reviews. So if you bear with me, I'm going to show you. This is something fun and new that I'm learning to do here. So if we look at the site, just remember when you get on the site, if you go and hit the For Parents tab at the top, all the educator resources that Eisha and Emily and Sophie have mentioned are on for educators. But if you go for parents and you look under the parent tips and FAQs, I just want to remind you, there is everything. There is our parent ultimate guides, which really are soup to nuts about everything from TikTok and Snapchat, how you can create the privacy controls, what is Snap Map, everything like that. So check that out. And we also have all these great topics. If you want to learn just more about social media, hit social media, and it'll give you so many different articles and information. In fact, I'll do that right now, and you can just see. We have everything from how to help girls have healthier social media experiences, and it brings up all of our ultimate guides as well. So I just really want to encourage you. I think we sometimes forget all the amazing stuff that's on the site, and it is free to use. So I would like to remind you to check it out. And also one last thing, we have a free newsletter that you can sign up for, and I will send that out as well shortly. And we also have a brand new Common Sense Media app as well. And you can download that from the App Store and on Google Play. And with that, it's a wrap. I just want to thank everyone for joining us, especially our panelists, and thank you for spending the time with us on this important topic.